universe screamed. Not in sound, but in the fundamental breaking of laws older than stars. Somewhere beyond mortal comprehension, where the source wall had stood guard over DC's reality for eons, a catastrophic rupture tore through the fabric of existence. At the same moment, in a dimension perpendicular to that catastrophe, the Beyonders conducted their latest experiment in reality manipulation. Two cosmic events separated by the infinite distance between multiverses reached toward each other like lightning seeking ground. And Kal-El, last son of Krypton, found himself caught in the arc. He had been investigating the wall's collapse, searching for survivors in the debris field of divine matter that had once imprisoned the multiversal threats. The crystalline fragments floated in the void, each piece still radiating the faint warmth of cosmic significance. His enhanced vision could perceive the threads of reality unraveling at their edges, entropy made visible. Then the pull began. It started as a tugging sensation against his flight, as though gravity had suddenly remembered him in the airless void. Superman adjusted his trajectory, compensating with the ease of decades of experience. But the force intensified, became directional, became hungry. Within 3 seconds, he understood this was not gravity. This was something drinking space itself, collapsing distance between points that should never touch. He tried to fly against it. His Kryptonian cells, supercharged with yellow solar radiation, pushed his velocity toward relativistic speeds, acceleration climbing past what any atmosphere-bound measurement could quantify. The vacuum around him rippled with the sheer force of his movement. But the pull matched him, then exceeded him, then rendered his efforts meaningless. The sensation reminded him of falling into a black hole. Except the darkness ahead pulsed with colors that had no names, wavelengths his enhanced vision had never processed. The rift opened like a wound in reality. Superman had seen dimensional portals before. Boom tubes, zeta beams, the controlled tears that speedsters created when they touched the time stream. This was none of those. This was reality rejecting itself, two fundamental forces of existence meeting in a space that could contain neither. The edges of the tear burned with an anti-light that hurt to perceive even for Kryptonian eyes capable of processing the full electromagnetic spectrum. He reached for his Justice League communicator, hoping to send a final signal, a warning that something had gone catastrophically wrong. His fingers found only static. The communicator's quantum entanglement had been severed, the connection to his universe cut as cleanly as a scalpel through skin. The rift swallowed him. Transition through the breach lasted both an instant and an eternity. Superman experienced the sensation of being unmade and remade simultaneously. Every atom of his being translated through a medium that physics had no equations to describe. For a frozen moment outside of time, he existed in both universes. At once his consciousness stretched across the gap like a bridge of living matter. He could feel the different laws of physics on each side, the subtle variations in how reality processed cause and effect, energy and matter, time and space. Then Marvel's universe claimed him, and Earth's gravity reasserted its authority with prejudice. The impact carved a crater 300 feet across in the Latvian countryside. Soil and stone erupted outward in a perfect circle, the shock wave flattening trees for half a mile in every direction. The sound arrived seconds after the destruction, a thunderclap that rattled windows in the capital city 15 miles distant. Seismographs at S.H.I.E.L.D.'s monitoring stations recorded the event as a magnitude 4.2 earthquake with an epicenter that made no geological sense. Superman lay at the center of the devastation, his red cape spread beneath him like a pool of blood. For the first time in years, he felt pain. Not the mild discomfort of exposure to kryptonite or magic, but genuine bone-deep agony that suggested his invulnerability had been compromised during the crossing. His healing factor began its work immediately, solar energy flooding damaged tissue, but the process felt slower here, less efficient. He pushed himself to his knees, then to his feet. The world swayed, then stabilized. His vision cleared, processing the new environment with methodical precision. The sun overhead felt wrong. Not red like Krypton's dying star, but yellow, like Earth's life-giving light. Yet the wavelength was subtly different. His cells absorbed the radiation, but the conversion to bioelectric energy happened at a reduced rate, perhaps 90% of normal efficiency. The landscape around him was European in character. Rolling hills, dense forests of oak and pine, the distant spires of Gothic architecture on the horizon. But the electromagnetic signatures were alien to him. The ambient radiation, the magnetic field strength, the very quantum foam that underlaid reality, all of it, registered as fundamentally other to his enhanced senses. His senses, normally a symphony of order, now returned discordant notes, as if the universe itself struggled to interpret what he was. He realized with perfect certainty that he was no longer in his universe. The truth settled over him like a weight. Every frequency his enhanced hearing processed belonged to a world that had never known Krypton's death, had never witnessed the rise of Kal-El. The magnetic field lines ran at angles that defied what his Kryptonian education had taught him about planetary formation. Even the sunlight, though yellow and life-giving, carried harmonics that his cells recognized as foreign, as slightly wrong, as requiring adaptation rather than simple absorption. He had crossed between realities. Somehow the rift had not destroyed him, but translated him, moved him from one corner of the infinite multiverse to another. The implications spiraled outward in his enhanced mind. Was the Justice League, Earth itself might as well be in another dimension, because effectively they were. Superman lifted his gaze to the horizon, searching for anything familiar, any landmark or signature that might ground him in this alien world. What he found instead was a fortress. Not a castle in the medieval sense, but a hybrid structure that blended Gothic architecture with technological advancement far beyond what he expected from the surrounding countryside. The edifice rose like a scar across the mountains, cold, ordered and radiating an energy signature he could not classify. Its presence spoke of absolute control of a mind that had bent an entire region to its will through force of intellect and power. Whoever ruled this land possessed capabilities that transcended normal human achievement. In the far distance, engines rumbled. Multiple armored vehicles closing fast. The precision of their formation, the disciplined radio chatter, his super hearing, detected the coordinated approach vectors. All of it suggested a military force that had been mobilized within minutes of his impact. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. Superman's tactical mind processed the situation with crystalline clarity. He was wounded, operating at reduced capacity in a universe whose rules he had not yet learned. His communicator was dead severed from the quantum entanglement that would have connected him to his league. The solar energy that powered his abilities felt somehow diluted here, less potent, requiring more time to achieve the same effects his body had performed effortlessly for decades. He was alone. Truly cosmically alone in a way he had not experienced since the day Krypton died. The engines grew louder. The fortress on the horizon seemed to watch him, with the patience of stone, waiting to see what this fallen god would do now that he stood in a world that did not know him, and a world he did not recognize. Superman straightened, ignoring the pain that still echoed through his cellular structure. His cape, torn and stained with the soil of this foreign earth, settled around his shoulders. Whatever came next, whoever commanded those approaching forces, he would face it as he had faced every challenge since the day he first took flight above Smallville. with hope, with strength, and with the absolute conviction that, even in a universe not his own, there would be those who needed protecting. The sun burned overhead with a brilliance he could draw strength from, but not yet trust. And across the shattered crater, the armored column broke through the tree line, converging on the impact site with mechanical inevitability. The armored column arrived with the efficiency of a surgical strike. 10 vehicles crested the ridge in perfect formation, their diesel engines synchronized to a rhythm that spoke of military precision rather than hurried deployment. They fanned out around the crater's perimeter, each positioning itself to maximize coverage, while minimizing exposure to potential threat. Soldiers emerged wearing gear that combined tactical armor with energy shielding their weapons, tracking Superman with the steady confidence of troops who had faced worse than a single alien standing in a hole. Then, the sky opened, and Victor Von Doom descended. The armor caught the morning light like a blade green, and silver plates seamless enough to suggest they had been grown rather than assembled. A cloak billowed behind the figure, despite the absence of wind held aloft by invisible force fields that bent air pressure to aesthetic will. When the boots touched earth at the crater's edge, the impact registered as calculated force, enough to demonstrate arrival, not enough to waste energy on dramatic flourish. Superman's enhanced vision cataloged every detail in microseconds. The suit was a masterwork fusing what appeared to be medieval craftsmanship with technology decades beyond anything his Earth had developed in portable form. Arc reactor equivalent in the chest displacement generators, in the boot's energy projection systems built into gauntlets that hummed with barely restrained power. But more concerning was the sensor array already sweeping across Superman's cellular structure, with analysis protocols that suggested whoever built this armor understood physics at a level that rivaled Kryptonian science. The faceplate was polished to mirror brightness, reflecting Superman's own battered image back at him. When the figure spoke, electronic modulation could not entirely mask the aristocratic precision beneath. The voice informed him that he had violated Latverian airspace, damaged Latverian soil, and triggered threat assessment protocols that had mobilized the full defensive capability of a sovereign nation. More importantly, the sensors had detected energy signatures that did not correspond to any known element in the periodic table radiation patterns that suggested extraterrestrial origin and a bioelectric field that registered as incompatible with baseline human physiology. Superman attempted diplomacy. He explained that his arrival had been unintentional, that he represented no threat to this nation or its people, that he required only information about where he had fallen and assistance in understanding the nature of the dimensional breach that had brought him here. Doom's response came with the flat certainty of someone delivering mathematical proof. Intentions were irrelevant when measured against capability. Superman's cellular structure, his energy absorption patterns, his demonstrable resistance to conventional physics, all of it rendered him a variable that could not be controlled and therefore could not be permitted to exist outside of Doom's understanding. The choice was simple: submit to examination or be neutralized as a threat to Latverian sovereignty. The gauntlets began to charge with inverse solar frequency. Superman moved. 200 feet crossed in less than a second speed that would have been instantaneous in his home universe. But here felt fractionally delayed, as though the space itself required additional convincing before it would allow such rapid displacement. His intention had been to disarm without injury, to demonstrate power while avoiding escalation. But Doom had been tracking his cellular resonance since the moment of impact. The armor's sensors had identified the solar dependency, calculated the inverse wavelength, and programmed the gauntlet emitters to generate radiation that drained rather than energized. The blast caught Superman mid-flight, a wave of anti-solar energy that felt like diving into a red sun's gravity well. He crashed into the crater wall hard enough to displace another ton of Earth. The sensation was novel. Not pain exactly, but the sudden absence of power, as though someone had opened a valve and allowed his reserves to leak into space. His healing factor compensated immediately, solar energy flooding the affected cells. But the principle remained disturbing. This armored dictator had analyzed and countered his primary advantage in seconds. Doom's voice carried satisfaction. The soldiers received new targeting protocols, their weapons adjusting frequency to match what their leader had discovered. The message was clear. Resistance would only accelerate the inevitable examination. Superman stood ignoring the ache in muscles that had forgotten what strain felt like. His tactical assessment was complete. The armor represented genuine threat, not because it could destroy him, but because its operator possessed the intelligence to continuously adapt. Every exchange would provide new data, new analysis, new counters. Fighting here would only give Doom more information while accomplishing nothing. He needed to disengage, needed space to understand this universe's rules before engaging in conflicts he could not yet predict. But Doom was already advancing gauntlets, charging for a second strike, soldiers tightening the perimeter with weapons that now hummed at frequencies designed specifically to weaken Kryptonian cellular structure. The decision took microseconds. Superman launched skyward acceleration, driving him past the sound barrier before the soldiers could adjust aim. The sonic boom flattened grass for a quarter mile. But he was already 5,000 feet up and climbing putting distance between himself and the threat, while his enhanced vision mapped the terrain below. Latveria spread beneath him like a kingdom from another era. Gothic architecture dominated the capital city's spires, reaching skyward with medieval ambition. But the industrial sectors told a different story. Manufacturing complexes that pulsed with energy signatures, suggesting advanced metallurgy power generation capabilities that exceeded what developing nations should possess. Defensive installations that tracked his flight with targeting solutions already calculating intercept vectors. At the center of it all rose the fortress he had glimpsed from ground level. Not merely a castle, but a technological stronghold that radiated energy across multiple spectrums. Its presence dominated the landscape with the weight of absolute authority. The physical manifestation of will imposed upon an entire nation. Doom's voice reached him even at this altitude, amplified through external speakers, powerful enough to make the air itself vibrate. The words carried simple arithmetic. Flight was pointless. Latverian airspace was sovereign, and defended surrender now would be interpreted as wisdom rather than weakness. Superman's response was to accelerate horizontally, aiming for what his vision identified as the national border 40 miles distant. Behind him, Doom's armor rocketed upward in pursuit, and the defensive grid came fully online with solutions that suggested the entire nation had been designed around the assumption that someday something would need to be shot out of the sky. The chase lasted 90 seconds. Doom's armor proved faster than Superman's compromised capabilities allowed. The gap closed with mechanical inevitability, weapons firing bursts of inverse solar radiation that forced evasive maneuvers. Each dodge cost energy, each course correction depleted reserves that were not recharging at their normal rate. Superman could feel the efficiency gap widening his body, struggling to process solar energy through wavelengths that his cells recognized as subtly wrong. At 30 miles from the border, he made the calculation. Continuing meant either escalating to speeds that might cause atmospheric damage or depleting his reserves to levels that would leave him vulnerable to whatever other threats this universe contained. Neither option served his ultimate goal of understanding where he was and how to return home. He descended. The landing carved a furrow through a farmer's field, soil cracking, but structures remaining intact. Doom arrived seconds later, armor positioning itself to maintain optimal weapon range while minimizing Superman's attack angles. The Man of Steel raised his hands, palms open. Not surrender, but cessation of hostilities. He needed answers more than he needed to prove strength to a dictator who clearly valued knowledge over conquest. His words were simple cooperation, in exchange for information, temporary alliance, in exchange for the data he required to understand his situation. Doom's faceplate caught the sun as the figure considered the proposal. Then, with a gesture that dismissed the surrounding military to observation distance, the armored tyrant accepted. Not from trust, but from recognition that Superman represented a source of knowledge about dimensional mechanics that no other opportunity would provide. The bargain was tactical, not ethical, and both parties understood the temporary nature of their arrangement. They lifted into the air together, Doom's repulsor technology and Superman's graviton manipulation, carrying them toward the fortress on the horizon. Behind them, Latverian forces withdrew to defensive positions, already transmitting analysis data to research facilities that would spend the next 72 hours attempting to reverse engineer Kryptonian cellular structure from the energy signatures left in the crater. And 400 miles to the west, in a brownstone sanctum in Greenwich Village, Dr. Stephen Strange felt reality bend. The sensation was not dramatic. No explosion of power, no cosmic fanfare announcing catastrophe. Simply a wrongness in the fundamental weave of space-time, as though someone had introduced a thread that did not belong to the tapestry. Strange's meditation shattered his consciousness, snapping back to his physical body with the jarring abruptness of a severed connection. His hands traced patterns in the air before conscious thought could direct them, mystic symbols forming to analyze the disturbance. What they revealed made no sense according to the laws that govern the seven realms. The energy signature registered as alien, not in the sense of extraterrestrial, but in the sense of extra-universal. It carried harmonics that did not correspond to any frequency in Marvel's reality wavelengths that suggested origin from a corner of existence that should be permanently isolated by the barriers between dimensions. Strange reached for the communication protocols that would alert the Vishanti to this breach, expecting immediate response from the entities that maintained cosmic order. Instead, his consciousness met resistance. Not a wall exactly, but a field of interference so comprehensive that even his astral form could not penetrate it. Someone or something had placed a barrier between Earth and the higher planes, severing the connection that allowed Sorcerer Supreme to petition for guidance in matters beyond mortal comprehension. For the first time in decades, Stephen Strange felt genuine concern. The nature of the interference suggested power on a scale that exceeded anything he had encountered since his training in the mystic arts. Only a handful of entities possessed the capability to block communication with abstract beings, and all of them represented extinction-level threats. He stood already reaching for artifacts stored in the sanctum's deepest vaults. Whatever had fallen into their universe, whatever had bent reality simply by existing within it, required immediate investigation. Not from curiosity, but from the cold recognition that anything capable of disrupting the fundamental laws of magic represented a danger to existence itself. The eye of Agamotto pulsed against his chest, its light reflecting off the windows of the sanctum, as Strange prepared to locate the source of the disturbance. In Latveria, Superman and Doom approached a fortress built on scientific tyranny, and between them, the invisible threads of catastrophe began to weave patterns that would draw Earth's defenders into conflict with forces they could not yet comprehend. The multiverse had been breached. The breach was widening, and no one with the power to stop it yet understood the true scope of what had begun. The alarm systems at the Triskelion activated within seconds of Superman's departure from Latverian airspace. Maria Hill stood before a wall of holographic displays, each screen showing a different analysis of the energy signature that had just torn through 3 separate satellite tracking networks. The readings made no sense, according to established physics. Whatever had generated the pulse possessed output levels comparable to a celestial awakening. but the frequency pattern matched nothing in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s extensive database of extraterrestrial contacts. She gave the order that elevated Earth's defensive posture to DEFCON 2, then initiated contact protocols with every enhanced individual on file. If this represented a new extinction-level threat, they would need every available asset mobilized before whoever or whatever had just arrived decided to demonstrate their full capabilities. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Dr. Strange's hands moved through forms that had been ancient when Atlantis still ruled the oceans. The symbols he traced in the air glowed with power, drawn from dimensions that existed perpendicular to normal space. Each gesture a question posed to forces that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. He was attempting to reach the Vishanti, the trinity of cosmic entities whose wisdom had guided sorcerers supreme for millennia. The connection refused to form. Not blocked exactly, but intercepted, as though someone had placed interference between Earth and the higher planes. Strange switched protocols, reaching instead for the living tribunal, the entity that maintained balance across all realities. Again, his consciousness met resistance that felt less like a wall and more like deliberate jamming, someone actively preventing communication between Earth's mystical defenders and the cosmic hierarchy that should be responding to a breach this severe. For the first time since assuming the mantle of Sorcerer Supreme, Stephen Strange found himself cut off from the sources of knowledge that had made his protection of Earth possible. Whatever had fallen into their dimension possessed either the power or the backing to isolate an entire planet from the supernatural forces that governed existence itself. He reached for his phone, dialing numbers that would alert the Avengers to a threat level he had hoped never to encounter outside theoretical discussions of multiversal collapse. 400 miles north in the mansion that served as headquarters for the X-Men cerebral amplification technology detected the anomaly through entirely different means. Charles Xavier's mental presence extended across the globe as a matter of routine surveillance monitoring for emerging mutant signatures and potential threats to his species. What his enhanced consciousness encountered over Latveria registered as biological but fundamentally alien, a mind that processed thought at speeds that suggested either artificial enhancement or evolution along paths humanity had never traveled. More concerning was the energy signature wrapped around that consciousness. Xavier had touched the minds of cosmic entities before, had brushed against the thoughts of beings like Galactus, whose mental architecture existed on scales that threatened to overwhelm human comprehension. This newcomer carried similar weight, similar presence, but with harmonics that suggested origin from beyond the boundaries of their reality. He convened an emergency session with the senior X-Men, his mental voice reaching across campus to summon those whose judgment he trusted in matters of planetary security. Scott Summers arrived first, followed by Storm, her weather sense already registering atmospheric disturbances that correlated with the stranger's flight path. Logan came last, his enhanced senses picking up tension in Xavier's posture that spoke of genuine concern rather than routine caution. The professor shared what he had sensed, then posed the question that would define their response. Was this being a refugee seeking sanctuary or an invasion force's advanced scout? The answer would determine whether they offered assistance or prepared for confrontation with an entity whose power level suggested he could level continents if provoked. In Asgard, Thor Odinson stood on the balcony of his chambers, gazing down at Midgard through vision that could pierce clouds and atmosphere to observe the realm he had sworn to protect. The light he had sensed earlier still burned in his enhanced perception, a radiance that reminded him of stellar cores rather than mortal technology. No being born of Earth should emit such brilliance, which meant either divine intervention or extraterrestrial arrival. He summoned Heimdall, requesting full analysis of the newcomer's energy signature. The guardian of the Bifrost, whose sight could perceive events across the 9 realms and beyond, provided assessment that deepened Thor's concern. The stranger carried power comparable to Asgardian gods, but with none of the markers that would indicate divine heritage or authority granted by higher cosmic forces. This was raw potential biological capability, elevated to levels that suggested the being had been purpose-built as a weapon, or had evolved on a world where such strength was necessary for mere survival. Thor made the decision to observe rather than engage, but he alerted the warriors 3 and Sif to prepare for potential deployment. If this newcomer proved hostile, Asgard would respond to protect Midgard regardless of the cost. Beneath the surface of Wakanda, in chambers carved from vibranium-laced stone that predated written history, King T'Challa reviewed intelligence reports compiled by his nation's surveillance network. Wakandan technology, decades beyond what the outside world had achieved, had tracked the object's descent from low orbit through atmospheric entry to impact in Latveria. The energy bloom from the crater had registered on sensors designed to detect nuclear detonations, but the radiation signature matched no known element or isotope. What concerned him was not the stranger's arrival, but the geopolitical implications of such power appearing without warning or announcement. Nations already feared Wakanda's advanced technology and strategic resources. If the international community discovered an entity with capabilities that eclipsed conventional military might, had simply appeared without triggering any early warning systems. The resulting panic could destabilize the fragile détente that kept the major powers from open conflict. He convened his advisory council, laying out scenarios that ranged from diplomatic contact to military containment. Wakanda's policy had always been to observe and assess before committing to action. But T'Challa recognized that this situation might require faster decisions than traditional caution would allow. Whatever had fallen from the sky possessed enough raw strength to tip the balance of power on a global scale, and whoever controlled or allied with such an entity would gain leverage that could reshape the political landscape overnight. The decision was made to increase defensive readiness while deploying intelligence assets to gather more complete information about the newcomer's intentions and capabilities. In orbit 43,000 miles above Earth's surface, the Avengers monitoring station detected the same anomaly that had triggered alerts across every major defense network on the planet. Tony Stark stood in the command center, holographic displays surrounding him with data streams that updated faster than unenhanced eyes could track. His armor's sensors linked to satellite arrays and ground-based observation posts had compiled a profile that defied every assumption he held about physics and biology. The stranger's cellular structure appeared to be absorbing solar radiation at rates that suggested his body was either a biological fusion reactor or operated on principles that made conventional energy physics look like kindergarten arithmetic. Flight capability without visible propulsion strength sufficient to create shock waves through atmosphere from sheer acceleration durability that had allowed atmospheric entry without protective shielding. Each data point individually was impressive, but the combination suggested something that should not exist outside theoretical discussions of technological singularities. Stark ran probability calculations, attempting to determine whether this represented alien arrival dimensional breach or artificial creation by some organization with capabilities exceeding his own considerable genius. All 3 scenarios carried implications that would require immediate Avengers response, though the specific nature of that response remained unclear until they had more complete intelligence. He initiated recall protocols, summoning team members from whatever assignments or personal time they had been engaged in. Within the hour, they would convene to discuss threat assessment and response options. Until then, Stark continued compiling data, building the most complete picture possible of what had just entered their world. Across the globe, in facilities both official and clandestine, similar analyses were being conducted by organizations ranging from government intelligence agencies to criminal enterprises that recognized opportunity when an unknown variable appeared. Everyone wanted to know the same things: who was this stranger? What were his capabilities? And most importantly, Could he be controlled, recruited, or if necessary, eliminated? Superman flying high above the Atlantic Ocean while attempting to process the overwhelming strangeness of this new reality. Had no awareness of the surveillance networks tracking his every movement or the councils debating his fate. He knew only that the sun here felt subtly wrong, that the world below him carried frequencies he had never encountered, and that somewhere in the fabric of space itself, the rift that had brought him here continued to widen. The watchers observed. The analysts compiled data. The decision-makers prepared responses. And in a dimension adjacent to normal space, an entity that had been observing these events with interest decided the time had come to intervene directly in what was becoming a most fascinating experiment. Superman circled the planet at 12,000 feet high enough to avoid commercial air traffic, but low enough that his enhanced vision could catalog the details of civilization below. What he saw disturbed him. His first orbit took him over Europe, then Asia, then across the Pacific toward the Americas. Every continent revealed similar patterns, cities fortified against threats, both external and internal. Military installations positioned not along national borders, but around population centers, defensive architectures that suggested the inhabitants expected attack from their own kind rather than foreign powers. This was a world perpetually braced for conflict, not between nations, but between different categories of human existence. Over New York, he slowed to subsonic velocities, his hearing parsing the cacophony of metropolitan life into individual threads. News broadcasts dominated the audible spectrum, and their content painted a picture of society fractured along lines he had never encountered on his Earth. Mutants, they called them humans, whose genetics had diverged enough to grant extraordinary abilities and who faced systematic persecution for differences they had not chosen and could not control. He heard politicians demanding registration, heard religious leaders calling mutation a plague upon humanity, heard ordinary citizens expressing fear that their neighbors might possess hidden capabilities that could manifest without warning. The rhetoric reminded him of the darkest periods in his adopted planet's history. Those eras when fear had been weaponized against the vulnerable and difference had been treated as crime. Manhattan's skyline below him included structures designed specifically for combat rather than commerce. Towers that bristled with weapons platforms, buildings reinforced to withstand superhuman assault. Entire districts that appeared to have been rebuilt multiple times after catastrophic destruction. This was not a city that had occasionally experienced crisis. This was a city that existed in a permanent state of preparedness for the next disaster. He ascended higher, pushing toward the boundary where atmosphere thinned into the void. At 40,000 feet, the curvature of the planet became pronounced, and he could see storm systems developing over the Atlantic, their patterns familiar, even if the electromagnetic signatures they generated carried those same wrong harmonics he had noticed since arrival. At 60,000 feet, he detected the first orbital installations. Satellite networks, far more extensive than his Earth, had deployed many of them clearly military in function rather than scientific or commercial. Weapons platforms tracked his ascent with targeting solutions that his vision could perceive as laser designators painting his position. Someone up there had decided he represented enough of a threat to warrant being held in crosshairs, though they had not yet made the decision to fire. He continued climbing. 70,000 feet, 80,000. The sky darkened from blue to black as atmosphere gave way to vacuum, and still he rose, testing the limits of this universe's tolerance for his presence. At 120,000 feet, he felt it. A resistance that had nothing to do with atmospheric friction or gravitational pull, but rather a fundamental property of space itself, pushing back against his attempt to achieve escape velocity. The sensation was subtle at first, like swimming against a current too gentle to impede, but strong enough to notice. As he accelerated, the resistance increased proportionally, not mechanically, but organically, as though the universe itself was aware of his attempt to leave and had decided to prevent it. He pushed harder. His Kryptonian physiology, even operating at reduced efficiency, should have been capable of achieving velocities that would carry him beyond planetary orbit and into deep space. But the resistance continued to scale with his effort, maintaining a constant ratio that suggested he was not fighting physics, but encountering a law specifically designed to contain him. After 3 minutes of sustained acceleration that should have carried him past the moon's orbit, he remained at 120,000 feet, his position relative to Earth unchanged, despite speed that would have been sufficient to escape any planet's gravity well. The truth settled over him with the weight of a sentence. He was trapped not by chains or cages, but by the fundamental architecture of this reality, which recognized him as foreign and refused to release him back into the void between universes. He ceased his attempt at departure and allowed himself to drift in the thin air at the edge of space, his enhanced vision turning toward the stars above. They looked wrong. Not dramatically so, but the constellations were shifted. The familiar patterns he had memorized during his youth in Kansas, replaced by arrangements that spoke of a different cosmic geography. This was not merely another planet in his universe. This was another universe entirely, with its own stellar cartography and its own laws governing how matter and energy interacted. Beyond the stars, too distant for normal vision, but clearly visible to Kryptonian sight that could perceive across electromagnetic spectra unavailable to baseline humans, he saw it. The rift, not a physical tear in space, but a disruption in the fundamental weave of reality. A place where the boundaries between his universe and this one had been forced into contact and were bleeding energy into each other like wounds that refused to close. The rift pulsed with harmonics he recognized from his own reality frequencies that carried the signature of the source wall's collapse, mixed with something else, something that felt deliberately engineered rather than naturally occurring. Someone on this side of the dimensional barrier was actively working to expand the breach, either in ignorance of the consequences or with full awareness that they were risking multiversal catastrophe. He calculated trajectories, estimated expansion rates based on the energy bloom he could perceive. If current trends continued, the rift would double in diameter within 72 hours. At that point, the bleed-through between universes would escalate from invisible metaphysical event to observable physical phenomenon. Objects would begin translating between realities. Laws of physics would start contradicting each other in overlapping spaces. And eventually, the two universes would be forced into such proximity that they would either merge or mutually annihilate. Millions would die in the initial stages. Billions if the cascade progressed to completion. Superman descended, allowing gravity to reclaim him as he fell back through the atmospheric layers he had just traversed. His decision crystallized during the descent, forming with the same absolute certainty that had always guided his choices when innocent lives hung in the balance. He could not return home. The universe had made that clear through mechanisms he did not yet understand, but could not overcome through simple application of strength. He could not seal the rift from this side without knowledge of the forces that had created it and the tools necessary to counteract them. And he could not simply flee to some remote corner of this reality and wait for catastrophe to resolve itself, because that had never been who he was, regardless of which universe he found himself in. The choice then was straightforward. He would remain. He would protect the people of this world from the consequences of a disaster they had not caused and did not deserve. He would find whoever was actively widening the breach and stop them through whatever means proved necessary. And he would do all of this while operating in a reality that did not know him, did not trust him, and had every reason to view his presence as threat rather than salvation. By the time he reached 10,000 feet, his path was set. He would need allies, would need to understand the political and social landscape well enough to navigate it without making the situation worse. He would need to prove through actions, rather than words, that his intentions aligned with protecting, rather than conquering. And most critically, he would need to work fast because 72 hours was not much time to prevent an extinction event. He adjusted his trajectory, aiming for the coordinates where his enhanced hearing had detected the most intense discussion of his arrival. New York City, where the concentration of enhanced individuals and defensive installations suggested this world's heroes made their base of operations. If he was going to forge alliances, that seemed the logical place to start. The Avengers Tower rose above Manhattan's skyline like a steel and glass monument to technological achievement. Superman angled his descent toward it, knowing that his approach would trigger every alarm system the building possessed. Knowing that he was about to face the first real test of whether this universe would accept his offer of help or reject him as invader. He hoped for the former. But he prepared himself for the latter, because hope without readiness was just another word for naivety and whatever else this strange new world had taught him in the hours since his arrival. It had made clear that survival here would require more than good intentions. The tower's defensive grid activated as he entered its airspace. Targeting lasers painted him from a dozen angles. Somewhere inside, alarms were undoubtedly screaming warnings about airspace violation and approaching threat. Superman slowed to a hover 100 feet from the building's upper levels, arms raised in a gesture of peaceful intent, and waited to see whether this world's defenders would grant him the opportunity to explain himself before they decided to respond with force. Below him, the city continued its frantic rhythm, millions of lives proceeding in ignorance of the dimensional catastrophe developing in the space above their planet. For them, this was just another day in a world that had long ago learned to accept the impossible as routine. For Superman, it was the beginning of a different kind of battle than any he had fought before, one where the enemy was not a villain to be defeated, but a cascade of consequences to be prevented, and where success would be measured not in victories, but in lives preserved against odds that grew worse with each passing hour. The negative zone breach opened without warning over Lower Manhattan at 11:43 in the morning. One moment, the sky above the financial district held nothing but scattered clouds and commercial aircraft following their designated flight corridors. The next space folded inward on itself, a rupture in the fabric of reality that vomited creatures into the atmosphere with the violence of a wound opening. The things that emerged defied categorization. Biomechanical horrors that seemed designed by physics that operated under entirely different rules. Their forms shifting between states of matter as though solidity was optional rather than mandatory. Superman was still a mile from Avengers Tower when the dimensional tear manifested. His enhanced hearing caught the screams before his vision registered the cause, and by the time his consciousness had processed what was happening, his body was already in motion. The distance vanished in a fraction of a second acceleration, driving him past the sound barrier, hard enough to shatter windows in his wake. He hit the first creature at sufficient velocity to carry both of them 3 blocks north before momentum transferred completely. The impact should have pulverized organic tissue, but the thing's body absorbed kinetic energy and reconstituted itself pseudopods. Lashing out with tips that glowed with radiation, his vision identified as outside normal electromagnetic spectra. No time for analysis. Civilians were scattering in panic below, and more creatures were pouring through the breach at a rate that suggested the rift was expanding rather than closing. Superman tore through the swarm with methodical brutality. Each strike calculated to disable without excessive force, each movement designed to draw the entities away from population centers and toward the East River, where collateral damage would be minimized. His heat vision lanced through biomechanical carapaces, the focused beams surgical in their precision. Where physical strikes proved insufficient, concentrated thermal energy did what brute force could not. disrupting the exotic matter that comprised these invaders and causing them to destabilize back into whatever dimension had spawned them. The entire engagement lasted 97 seconds. When the last creature dissolved into quantum foam, Superman hovered above the river, his uniform torn in 3 places where those strange radiation lashes had penetrated his bioelectric aura. The wounds were already closing, solar energy flooding damaged tissue with healing properties. But the fact that they had wounded him at all spoke to how dangerous the entities had been. Below, emergency services were converging on the area, and his enhanced hearing picked up the chaos of coordination as first responders tried to assess casualties while simultaneously evacuating the zone in case more breaches occurred. His visual scan confirmed what the initial screaming had suggested: hundreds injured from the panic and falling debris, but no fatalities. He had been fast enough. Before he could descend to offer assistance, his senses detected the second crisis developing 3,000 miles west. The celestial signal originated from beneath the Mojave Desert, a pulse of energy so massive it registered on his perception like a second sun igniting beneath the Earth's crust. The harmonic was unmistakable, a beacon, a call, a summons transmitted on frequencies that suggested technology millions of years beyond human capability. Whatever was buried under that desert had just activated after an eternity of dormancy, and the energy signature suggested something that could crack continental plates if its awakening proved violent. Superman made the calculation in microseconds. New York's crisis was contained. The Mojave situation was escalating. He turned west and accelerated, pushing his compromised efficiency to its limits, feeling the air resistance fight his passage as though the atmosphere itself questioned his right to move at such speeds through its domain. He crossed the continent in 8 minutes, arriving above coordinates where seismic sensors must have been screaming warnings about geological instability that made no sense, according to natural tectonic activity. The sand below was shifting ancient stone, pushing upward against gravity and friction. Something vast, stirring beneath sediment that had not been disturbed since before human civilization began recording its history. Superman descended using his vision to penetrate layers of rock and earth, mapping the structure of what lay buried. What he found made him recalculate the threat assessment upward by an order of magnitude. The entity was larger than mountain ranges, its body composed of materials that absorbed and refracted his X-ray vision, in patterns suggesting intentional design rather than natural formation. And it was waking systems coming online, with the slow inevitability of tides reversing course. He could not allow it to surface in this location. Population centers dotted the region, and if this thing emerged with hostile intent or even simple disregard for surface life, the casualties would be measured in millions before anyone could mount effective response. His hands plunged into stone Kryptonian strength, sufficient to part rock like water. He tunneled downward, creating a shaft that would have required industrial equipment and months of work for baseline humans to accomplish. His goal was the signal source, the mechanism broadcasting that awakening call. If he could disrupt it, perhaps the entity would return to dormancy before completing whatever process had begun. 40 seconds of drilling through geology that grew progressively harder as he descended. 60 seconds. 90. The heat from friction should have been sufficient to melt the surrounding stone, but his bioelectric aura absorbed and dispersed the thermal energy, preventing the tunnel from collapsing behind him. At 2,000 feet, he reached the device. It was beautiful in its alien geometry, crystalline structures that pulsed with light across spectra, visible and invisible, each pulse synchronizing with the entity's awakening far below. Superman wrapped both hands around the central component and pulled applying force that increased incrementally until the mechanism tore free from its housing with a shriek of protesting matter. The signal ceased. The entity's awakening halted mid-process, its vast systems powering down, with what his enhanced hearing interpreted as something disturbingly close to frustration. Crisis averted at least temporarily, though Superman recognized this was a delay rather than a solution. Whatever intelligence had designed that beacon would likely attempt to reactivate it, which meant this desert would require monitoring until permanent countermeasures could be established. He emerged from the tunnel to find military helicopters circling his position, weapons trained on him, with the nervous readiness of forces confronting something they could not predict or control. He raised his hands, the beacon still clutched in one fist, and allowed them to verify he was not continuing whatever excavation had triggered their deployment. Before diplomatic communications could be established, his hearing caught the third crisis erupting on the opposite side of the planet, Genosha, the island nation where mutants had established their own society, separate from the baseline humanity that had persecuted them for generations. The sounds reaching him across 5,000 miles of ocean and landmass spoke of violence, of energy weapons firing, and streets of screaming that carried the particular timbre of hatred given voice and action. Superman hesitated for the first time since the crises had begun cascading. This was not a natural disaster or alien invasion, but human conflict, the kind of entrenched hatred that could not be solved through application of superior strength. Intervening in a civil dispute, especially one rooted in the complex history of a world he did not yet understand, carried risks that pure rescue operations did not. But the screaming continued, and among the voices crying out in rage or fear, he detected children. Whatever political complexities divided the factions on that island, whatever historical grievances fueled the current violence, there were innocents caught in the crossfire who had not chosen their genetics any more than he had chosen to be born Kryptonian. The decision made itself. He accelerated eastward, leaving the bewildered military personnel to secure the celestial beacon while he crossed the Atlantic at speeds that turned ocean spray into supersonic mist. Genosha's capital was burning when he arrived, not metaphorically, but literally entire districts aflame, while armed factions exchanged fire through streets that should have been marketplaces and residential zones. His enhanced vision identified the combatants' mutants on one side, their abilities ranging from energy projection to physical transformation, and what appeared to be anti-mutant extremists on the other, armed with weapons designed specifically to counter superhuman capabilities. Superman descended into the middle of the firefight, his invulnerability sufficient to weather attacks from both sides as he interposed himself between the factions. His heat vision disabled weapons before they could discharge careful applications of force, separated combatants without inflicting injury. And his sheer presence created enough confusion that the shooting stopped long enough for voices to be heard over the violence. He did not speak. This was not his conflict to resolve through words, and any statement he made would be interpreted through lenses of prejudice and fear he did not yet comprehend. Instead, he simply stood between the factions, a living barrier that neither side could overcome through force, and waited to see if the pause would be enough for reason to reassert itself over rage. The standoff held for 17 seconds before someone on the human side fired. Anyway, their weapons discharged, painting Superman with energy that would have been lethal to mutants, but felt like mild static against his Kryptonian biology. The shot had been aimed past him, targeting mutants who had lowered their guard when violence paused. Superman moved. The shooter found himself disarmed and deposited 3 blocks away before his finger could release the trigger for a second attempt. The message was clear: violence would not be tolerated, regardless of which side initiated it. The fires still burned. The hatred still simmered beneath the temporary peace his presence had imposed. But the immediate killing had stopped, and emergency services were beginning to reach the wounded from both factions. It would have to be enough. Superman could not remain here indefinitely, could not solve centuries of human cruelty and fear through simple intervention. What he could do was create space for cooler minds to prevail, could prevent the worst atrocities, while others worked toward actual solutions. As he ascended back into the atmosphere, leaving Genosha's emergency responders to coordinate recovery efforts, his enhanced hearing painted a picture of global reaction to his interventions. News networks were broadcasting footage from all three crises, their coverage ranging from awed gratitude to terrified speculation about his intentions. Social media platforms overflowed with debate about whether this alien stranger represented salvation or threat, whether his power made him protector or tyrant in waiting. The world, it seemed, could not decide if he was their greatest hope or their most dangerous problem. Superman flew higher, seeking the thin silence at the edge of space where he could think without the constant assault of humanity's noise. 3 crises in less than an hour. 3 catastrophes that should not have occurred simultaneously unless something was actively destabilizing this reality to create opportunities for chaos. The rift. It had to be related to the dimensional breach he had observed earlier. As the barrier between universes weakened, the fundamental laws maintaining order were breaking down, allowing events that should have been isolated incidents to cascade into synchronized disasters. 72 hours he had estimated. But if the rate of breakdown was accelerating, that timeline might prove optimistic. He needed allies, needed to stop whoever was actively widening the breach, needed to act before the next wave of catastrophe struck. Below him, the planet continued its rotation, and somewhere in the chaos of its competing factions and ancient hatreds, decisions were being made about how to respond to the stranger who had just saved thousands of lives while simultaneously demonstrating power that no terrestrial force could match or contain. Superman hoped they would choose cooperation. But he prepared himself for the alternative because hope untempered by realism was just another form of weakness, and whatever else this universe had taught him, it had made brutally clear that weakness here would be exploited without mercy or hesitation. The laboratory existed in a pocket of folded space beneath the Latverian capital, shielded from conventional detection by layers of technology and sorcery that rendered it invisible to everything from satellite surveillance to mystical scrying. Victor Von Doom stood before a containment field that held the energy sample he had extracted from Superman's impact site, the residual radiation from the dimensional breach glowing with frequencies that had no place in Marvel's reality. Across from him, separated by 3,000 miles of spatial compression, achieved through technology borrowed from his Ultimate Universe origins, Reed Richards stood in his own laboratory. Not the Richards who led the Fantastic Four, but his darker reflection, the Maker, who had perfected the art of transforming idealism into pragmatic ruthlessness through decades of carefully calculated atrocities. The holographic link between them rendered distance meaningless. They examined the same data simultaneously. Their intellects, arguably the 2 greatest scientific minds, their respective realities had produced racing through calculations that would have required supercomputers centuries to process. The Maker spoke first, his words carrying the flat precision of someone who had long ago abandoned emotional inflection in favor of pure information transfer. The energy signature was unprecedented, he noted. Not alien in the conventional sense of extraterrestrial origin, but fundamentally incompatible with the base constants that defined their universe's physics. The sample Doom had collected represented matter and energy that had been translated from a reality operating under entirely different laws, and the translation process had left traces of both origin and destination coded into its quantum structure. Doom's response acknowledged the assessment while adding his own observations. The magical components of the energy defied classification according to any tradition he had mastered, from Atlantean sorcery to Asgardian runic arts. Whatever metaphysical framework governed Superman's home universe, it operated on principles orthogonal to Marvel's established supernatural hierarchies. More intriguingly, the energy appeared to be self-stabilizing, actively resisting dissipation, despite existing in an environment where it should have decayed into baseline radiation within hours. The Maker's fingers moved through holographic interfaces, manipulating data structures visible only to him. His analysis suggested the energy's stability derived from its connection to the breach itself. As long as the dimensional rift remained open, however minimally, the sample would maintain coherence, which meant he continued with the methodical inevitability of someone following a logical chain to its conclusion. That by studying the sample's resonance patterns, they could map the rift's exact location and structure. Doom understood the implication immediately. Map the rift, and they could potentially expand it. Create a controlled gateway, rather than a random tear. Access whatever lay on the other side, whether that meant resources knowledge, or simply the opportunity to study an entirely different set of physical laws. The Maker proposed a device. Something that would use the energy sample as a template generating matching frequencies to establish resonance with the distant breach. The effect would be analogous to using a tuning fork to find the pitch of a distant bell, follow the harmonics, amplify them, and the source would reveal itself. He could provide the dimensional mechanics, having mapped thousands of alternate realities during his conquest of the ultimate universe. Doom would need to contribute the mystical components, the sorcerous framework that would allow technology to interact with forces that existed partially outside conventional space-time. Victor Von Doom had not achieved mastery over both science and magic by ignoring opportunity when it presented itself. He agreed to the collaboration, though his mind was already calculating contingencies for the inevitable moment when their alliance would dissolve into competition. The Maker was thinking the same Doom knew. That was the nature of genius untempered by ethics. Every partnership was temporary, every ally a future adversary. Construction began immediately. In Latveria, automated systems assembled components according to specifications Doom transmitted through encrypted channels. In the Maker's laboratory, similar construction proceeded at accelerated pace technology that had conquered a universe being repurposed for dimensional manipulation. The two devices built on opposite sides of the planet would function as paired resonators, triangulating the breach's location through quantum entanglement and mystical sympathy. 72 hours after Superman's arrival, exactly when the Kryptonians' calculations had suggested the timeline would become critical, the devices activated. The effect was immediate and catastrophic in ways neither genius had anticipated. The resonance they had intended to use for mapping became amplification. Instead, the paired devices creating a feedback loop that poured energy into the distant rift faster than its natural dissipation could compensate. What had been a hairline fracture in reality became a wound tearing wider under the pressure of forces that treated dimensional barriers as obstacles to be overcome rather than absolutes to be respected. In orbit above Earth, Superman felt the change. The rift's expansion registered on his enhanced senses like a scream transmitted through subspace, a fundamental wrongness that made his Kryptonian biology recoil on an instinctive level. He turned his vision toward the source, perceiving across distances that should have been impossible even for him, and witnessed the barrier between universes stretching like membrane under tension. Then the bleeding began. Over New York, the sky flickered. For 3 seconds, the familiar vista of Marvel's skyline was overlaid with something else, taller spires, different architectural aesthetics, a cityscape that belonged to a world where Art Deco had evolved along subtly different paths. Pedestrians looked up, saw the ghostly superimposition, and in that moment of double vision, witnessed a building that should not exist bearing a sign that read, "Daily Planet," in letters 100 feet tall. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, reality reasserting itself with the finality of a door slamming shut. But the damage was done. Millions had seen the overlap, had glimpsed proof that their universe was not alone, that something else existed beyond the boundaries they had assumed were absolute. Similar manifestations occurred globally. In London, Westminster Abbey briefly shared space with a cathedral whose architecture suggested Byzantine origins filtered through a completely different historical development. In Tokyo, holographic advertisements flickered into signs, written in alphabets that no Earth language had ever used. In Cairo, the pyramids were momentarily joined by obelisks that had never been constructed, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs describing gods whose names appeared in no terrestrial mythology. Each manifestation lasted only seconds, but their cumulative effect was panic on a scale Earth had rarely experienced. Social media exploded with footage conspiracy theories and terrified speculation about what the overlaps meant. Were they being invaded? Was reality collapsing? Had some experiment gone catastrophically wrong? Dr. Strange felt the dimensional bleeding through his mystical senses and immediately understood what had happened. Someone had been manipulating the breach, attempting to study or exploit it, and their interference had accelerated the convergence he had feared since first detecting Superman's arrival. He reached for communication with the Avengers, with anyone who might possess the capability to intervene, knowing even as he did so that the technology capable of causing this level of disruption was likely beyond conventional response. In his laboratory, Doom observed the cascade of unintended consequences his collaboration with the Maker had triggered. The devices were still active, still pouring resonant energy into the rift, and the feedback loop showed no signs of natural termination. Shutting down the Latverian component would only shift the imbalance, potentially causing worse disruption. The only solution was coordinated deactivation, precise timing that would require trust between himself and the Maker. Trust neither of them possessed. The Maker's communication confirmed Doom's assessment. They had miscalculated. The rift was not a static phenomenon, but a dynamic system, and their interference had pushed it past a critical threshold. The convergence between universes was now self-sustaining, each overlap feeding energy back into the process and accelerating the next manifestation. Within hours, the bleeding would become continuous. Within days, the two realities would be forced into such proximity that separation might become impossible. Doom made the calculation that had defined his entire approach to power. This situation could still be salvaged, could still be turned to advantage, but not through the current collaboration. He transmitted a final message to the Maker, informing him that Latveria was implementing containment protocols and severing the connection between devices. Then he activated systems that would collapse the dimensional resonator into quantum foam, destroying the evidence of his involvement, while hopefully reducing the feedback into the rift. The Maker's response was silence, which Doom interpreted correctly as the other genius reaching the same conclusion from his own perspective. Their alliance had lasted exactly as long as mutual benefit, and now they would each pursue their own solutions to the crisis they had created. In space, Superman watched the rift pulse with renewed vigor, its expansion rate climbing exponentially. His 72-hour estimate had been based on natural progression. With human interference accelerating the process, he revised his timeline downward. 48 hours. Perhaps less if whoever had caused this continued their experiments. He descended toward Earth, targeting the region where his enhanced senses detected the highest concentration of dimensional instability. Answers would be found there, and more importantly, whoever was responsible would be found there. The time for observation had ended. The time for direct intervention had begun, whether this world's defenders welcomed it or not. The figure appeared in Times Square at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon, manifesting between one heartbeat and the next, as though he had always been standing there, and reality had simply forgotten to notice until that precise moment. He wore white. Not the sterile white of medical facilities or the pristine white of fresh snow, but a white that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a color that suggested the absence of all other colors rather than their combination. His form was human enough to avoid immediate panic: 2 arms, 2 legs, a face with features arranged in conventional patterns. But something in the proportions felt wrong, as though whoever had designed this body had worked from descriptions rather than observation. People walked past him for 17 seconds before someone noticed. Then the screaming began. Not because he did anything threatening. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, expression neutral, observing the flow of humanity around him, with the detached curiosity of an entomologist studying insects. But his presence triggered something primal, some instinct buried in human DNA that recognized when it was in the presence of something that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. The Beyonder. For that was what he had called himself in previous interactions with this reality, though names were meaningless to an entity that existed. Partially outside sequential time had been watching Superman since the moment the Kryptonian crossed dimensional boundaries. The observation had been passive at first, simple data collection about an anomaly that should not exist according to the rules governing multiversal isolation. But as the stranger's actions accumulated, as his interference in local events demonstrated capabilities that suggested origin from a reality with fundamentally different physical laws, passive observation had evolved into active interest. This Superman was a catalyst. His mere existence in Marvel's universe was causing resonance effects that the Beyonder found fascinating. The dimensional rift was widening not merely because of Doom and the Maker's clumsy interference, but because Superman's bioelectric field was generating harmonics that actively destabilized the barrier between realities. The Kryptonian was a living bridge, his cellular structure coded with the physics of one universe while operating in another, and that contradiction was forcing both realities to acknowledge each other's existence in ways that should have been impossible. The Beyonder had decided to accelerate the process. Not out of malice, he was beyond such primitive emotional states, but from pure curiosity about what would happen when 2 fundamental incompatible realities were forced into convergence. Would they merge, creating a hybrid universe that operated under blended laws? Would they annihilate each other, canceling out like matter meeting antimatter? Or would something entirely unprecedented occur? Something that even his vast intelligence could not predict? Only one way to find out. His first action was to neutralize the cosmic hierarchy that might interfere with the experiment. Across the planet, in vaults and sanctums and hidden dimensions, artifacts of immense power suddenly went dormant. The Infinity Gauntlet, capable of rewriting reality itself, became inert metal and stone. The ultimate nullifier, designed to erase targets from existence, lost its connection to the universal substrate it was meant to manipulate. The quantum bands channeling energies from the beginning of time fell silent as though their power source had been severed. Dr. Strange felt the change immediately. The eye of Agamotto, which had hung warm against his chest since he had assumed the mantle of Sorcerer Supreme, went cold. His connection to the Vishanti, already weakened by interference he had detected days ago, vanished entirely. The mystical framework that allowed him to protect Earth from supernatural threats simply stopped responding, as though someone had reached into the fundamental architecture of magic and flipped a switch marked off. In Asgard, similar disruption manifested. Heimdall's all-seeing vision, capable of perceiving events across the 9 realms, found itself constrained to purely local observation. The Bifrost, powered by cosmic energies older than most civilizations, struggled to maintain stable wormhole connections. Odin, feeling the change through senses honed over millennia of divine existence, understood immediately that something with power rivaling the Celestials had just imposed its will upon reality. The Beyonder's second action was more subtle but far more consequential. He began adjusting the fundamental constants that maintained separation between Marvel and the universe Superman originated from. Not dramatically collapsing dimensional barriers required finesse rather than force. But methodically, carefully, he started reducing the resistance that kept the two realities distinct. Think of it as reducing the surface tension between two liquids. They remained separate, but the energy required to mix them decreased with each adjustment. Eventually, a threshold would be reached where separation became energetically unfavorable, and the universes would begin flowing into each other with the inevitability of water-seeking equilibrium. Superman detected the change from his position above the Atlantic Ocean. The rift he had been monitoring pulsed with renewed activity, its expansion rate climbing beyond even the accelerated timeline he had calculated after Doom's interference. But more concerning was the quality of the expansion. Previously, the breach had felt random, chaotic, a wound torn by incompatible forces colliding. Now it felt directed, purposeful, as though an intelligence was guiding its growth according to specific parameters. He turned his enhanced vision toward Earth, scanning for the source of this new interference. What he found made him revise every assumption he had made about the nature of the threat he faced. The figure in Times Square registered on his perception as a void, a gap in causality where something existed that his senses could not properly process. Not invisible, but fundamentally unreadable, as though the entity had properties that Kryptonian biology was not equipped to interpret. The crowd fleeing from the figure's presence suggested visibility to baseline humans, which meant the problem was not with Superman's vision, but with the target itself. It existed in a state that defied conventional observation. He descended, crossing 500 miles in under a minute, decelerating as he entered the city's airspace to avoid sonic damage to the structures below. By the time he reached Times Square, the area had been cleared by a combination of panic and police cordons, leaving only the figure in white standing amid the abandoned infrastructure of commerce and entertainment. The Beyonder turned to face him as he landed, and Superman experienced something he had not felt since the earliest days of his powers, manifesting genuine uncertainty about what his senses were reporting. The entity before him registered as human-shaped, but the signals his vision processed suggested it occupied more dimensions than the conventional 4. Its true form extending into spaces that baseline perception could not access. When the Beyonder spoke, his voice carried the flat effect of someone for whom language was a tool rather than a natural mode of expression. He acknowledged Superman's arrival, noted that the Kryptonians' interference in local events had been observed with interest, and stated with clinical precision that the current convergence between universes represented an experiment in multiversal dynamics that Superman should not attempt to disrupt. Superman's response was equally direct. He indicated that the convergence would result in catastrophic loss of life across both realities, that whatever scientific curiosity drove this experiment could not justify the extinction-level consequences, and that he would oppose any attempt to continue the process regardless of who was orchestrating it. The Beyonder considered this for 3 seconds, his expression unchanging. Then he explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student that Superman's opposition was irrelevant. The cosmic hierarchy that might have possessed sufficient power to interfere had been neutralized. The artifacts that could have disrupted the experiment were dormant. The abstract entities that maintained multiversal order had been isolated from this sector of reality. Earth's defenders were alone, facing a process they could neither understand nor prevent. As if to demonstrate the point, the sky above Manhattan flickered. For 5 seconds, the familiar blue was replaced by a deeper shade, closer to violet, the color of skies under a different sun in a reality that obeyed subtly different atmospheric physics. Buildings shimmered their forms, overlaid with architectural ghosts that suggested the same locations developed by different civilizations following divergent aesthetic philosophies. The manifestation faded, but its message was clear. The convergence was accelerating under the Beyonders' direction, and nothing in this universe's conventional defensive arsenal could slow it, much less stop it. Superman made his decision in the microsecond between the Beyonders' demonstration ending and his next words beginning. This entity operated on scales that might exceed even his ability to match through pure physical force. But force had never been the only tool in his arsenal. And sometimes the most effective way to stop an unstoppable threat was not through opposition, but through disruption of the underlying assumptions that made it function. He told the Beyonder that the experiment would fail, not because of superior power, but because the Beyonder had made a fundamental miscalculation about what held universes together. It was not merely physical laws or cosmic hierarchies, but the collective will of the beings who inhabited those realities. And human will, Superman had learned through decades of experience, was the one force that no amount of power could reliably predict or control. The Beyonder's expression shifted for the first time since his manifestation, a micro-expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been amusement. He acknowledged Superman's statement, noted that it represented an interesting hypothesis about consciousness affecting physical law, and suggested that the next 48 hours would provide ample data to test which of them was correct. Then he vanished, not through movement, but through cessation, as though reality had simply decided he was no longer occupying that specific coordinate in space-time. Superman stood alone in the empty square, hearing sirens, approaching from multiple directions, knowing that in moments he would be surrounded by forces demanding explanations he could not provide and cooperation he could not guarantee. Above him, the rift pulsed with malevolent vitality, spreading like infection through the barrier between universes. 48 hours until total convergence. Perhaps less if the Beyonder accelerated his timeline further. Superman lifted into the air, already calculating vectors and probabilities, already formulating plans that balanced impossible odds against unacceptable alternatives. The real battle had just begun, and for the first time since arriving in this strange reality, he was facing an opponent who could not be defeated through superior strength or speed. This would require something more fundamental, something that transcended physics and touched on the question of why conscious beings tried to exist at all, even in the face of entropy and extinction. It would require hope, not as an emotion, but as a force capable of bending reality itself. And if there was one thing Superman had learned in his years of defending the impossible against the inevitable, it was that hope properly applied could move worlds. The first sign that reality was losing cohesion came at dawn on the second day after the Beyonder's manifestation. In London, Big Ben struck 13. Not a malfunction of its mechanical components, but a genuine 13th hour appearing between 12 and 1 time itself, subdividing incorrectly as 2 different temporal frameworks tried to occupy the same chronological space. Clocks across the city went haywire, some running backward, others accelerating forward, a few simply stopping, as though time had become optional rather than mandatory. In Mumbai, buildings began flickering between architectural states. A high-rise would be steel and glass, one moment Art Deco stone the next, then back again cycling through versions of itself that existed in parallel timelines, now bleeding into each other. Residents evacuated in panic as their homes became uncertain. Walls shifting position, with each flicker rooms rearranging themselves according to floor plans that belonged to structures that had never been built in this reality. Over the Pacific Ocean, the water itself developed discontinuities. Ships reported sailing through zones where the sea changed color mid-wave, where currents reversed direction without transition, where entire square miles of ocean seemed to belong to a different planetary body with subtly altered salinity and temperature. Aircraft avoided the region entirely after 3 commercial flights experienced simultaneous instrument failure when passing through airspace that couldn't decide which set of physical laws to follow. Superman flew through it all, his enhanced senses cataloging the breakdown with growing alarm. The manifestations were no longer brief flickers, but sustained overlaps. Realities pressing against each other with increasing force until the barriers between them began to fail. He could see the process accelerating each hour, bringing worse fragmentation than the last. In New York, he watched Avengers Tower exist in superposition with a structure that had never been built there. Something taller, more ornate, with architectural elements suggesting a civilization that had developed aesthetic sensibilities along completely different paths. The overlap lasted for 90 seconds before Marvel's version reasserted itself. But during those 90 seconds, anyone looking at the building would have seen both structures occupying the same coordinates, ghost-like and impossible. Dr. Strange contacted him through mystical means that bypassed conventional communication technology. The Sorcerer Supreme had been monitoring the convergence from the Sanctum Sanctorum, using what limited magical capability remained available to him to map the pattern of reality breakdown. What he had discovered confirmed Superman's worst fears. The convergence was not random. It was systematic, methodical, a carefully orchestrated collapse that suggested someone was actively guiding the process. More critically, Strange's analysis had identified the focal point of the entire phenomenon, the single coordinate in space-time where the two realities were most strongly coupled. That coordinate was Superman's current position. Wherever he went, the convergence intensified around him. He was not merely witnessing the breakdown, but causing it, his Kryptonian biology acting as a beacon that drew the two universes together like iron filings responding to magnetic attraction. Strange's assessment was brutal in its clarity. As long as Superman remained in Marvel's universe, his presence would continue amplifying the convergence. The Beyonder had been correct. The Kryptonian was the catalyst, the living bridge between realities that made the experiment possible. Removing him might slow the process, perhaps even halt it, but that would require Superman to somehow return to his home universe. And the barriers between dimensions were now so degraded that attempting transit might trigger immediate total collapse. They were trapped in a scenario with no good options. Superman staying accelerated the convergence. Superman leaving might trigger instant catastrophe. And through it all, the Beyonder observed from wherever he had withdrawn to watching his experiment progress toward conclusions that only he could predict. In the skies above Metropolis, not Marvel's version, but the genuine article bleeding through from DC's reality with increasing stability, Superman saw the Daily Planet building solidify into full visibility. The structure now existed in both universes, simultaneously, its foundation anchored in one reality, while its upper floors occupied another. Pedestrians from both worlds walked past it, each group seeing only their own version, while remaining invisible to the other two populations, sharing space without awareness of their ghostly neighbors. The sight triggered something in Superman's enhanced cognition, a realization about the fundamental nature of what was happening. The Beyonder had called this an experiment, a test of what occurred when incompatible realities were forced into contact. But experiments required variables, required some element of uncertainty about the outcome, which meant the Beyonder himself did not know what would happen when convergence reached completion. That uncertainty was a weakness. Not one that could be exploited through conventional means, but a gap in the entity's omniscience that suggested his control over the process was less absolute than his demonstration had implied. He was guiding the convergence, accelerating it, but he was not dictating its final form. That remained undetermined, subject to influences he could not entirely predict. Superman descended to street level in what was rapidly becoming a hybrid city. Marvel's New York overlaid with elements of DC's Metropolis in an ever-shifting mosaic of architectural impossibility. People were fleeing now the realization that their world was literally coming apart, driving mass evacuations that clogged highways and overwhelmed transportation infrastructure. He needed to reach the Beyonder, needed to disrupt whatever mechanism was driving the systematic nature of the collapse. But the entity had withdrawn from physical space after their confrontation, and Superman's attempts to locate him through enhanced vision yielded nothing. Wherever the Beyonder was observing from, it was a vantage point that existed outside the conventional dimensions Superman could perceive. Strange's voice reached him again this time, with urgency that overrode mystical calm. The convergence had reached critical threshold. Within the next 6 hours, the two realities would be so deeply entangled that separation would become energetically impossible. They would either merge completely, creating a hybrid universe that operated under blended physics, or they would annihilate each other as incompatible laws attempted to occupy the same space-time coordinates. Either outcome meant the end of both universes as they currently existed. Billions dead in the initial collapse, trillions more, as the cascade effects propagated through civilizations that depended on stable physical law for their continued existence. Superman made his decision. If he was the anchor, the focal point around which the convergence was organizing itself, then his bioelectric field must be generating some signal that the Beyonder was using to coordinate the process, which meant changing that signal might disrupt the careful orchestration, might introduce chaos into what was currently a controlled experiment. He flew to the edge of the atmosphere, seeking the thin boundary between air and void, where solar radiation was strongest and least filtered by atmospheric interference. There he began absorbing energy at rates that pushed his cellular structure past comfortable limits. The yellow sun of Marvel's Earth, despite its reduced efficiency compared to his home star, still possessed enough raw power to charge his Kryptonian biology beyond normal operational thresholds. His body began to glow bioelectric aura, intensifying until it became visible to baseline human perception. He was supercharging himself, pulling in more solar energy than his cells were designed to safely contain, deliberately destabilizing his own quantum signature to introduce noise into whatever signal the Beyonder was reading. The effect was immediate. Around him, the convergence pattern shifted the systematic organization, giving way to chaotic fluctuation. Buildings that had been solidifying into hybrid forms began flickering again, unable to maintain stable configuration as Superman's bioelectric interference disrupted the coupling between realities. He felt the Beyonder's attention shift, felt that vast intelligence focusing on the anomaly he was creating. This was working, but it was also unsustainable. The energy levels he was maintaining would exhaust his reserves within minutes, and when he depleted his charge, the convergence would resume with renewed intensity. But minutes were enough. Enough to prove that the process could be disrupted. Enough to demonstrate that the Beyonder's experiment was not proceeding according to pure physical law, but was dependent on active coordination that could be interfered with. Enough to show that hope embodied as deliberate defiance of apparent inevitability could still bend the arc of catastrophe towards something other than extinction. Below him, The hybrid city stabilized slightly, the rate of new manifestations slowing as his interference propagated through the coupling field. It would not last. He knew that. But it was proof of concept demonstration that the convergence was not unstoppable, merely very difficult to stop. And Superman had built a career on doing very difficult things. His enhanced hearing detected movement behind him. Not physical displacement, but reality bending to accommodate something that had chosen to manifest in this specific location. He turned still glowing with barely contained solar energy and found himself facing the Beyonder once again. The entity's expression carried something that might have been annoyance or might have been respect. It was difficult to read emotion in features that seemed human, but operated according to entirely different internal logic. The Beyonder acknowledged Superman's interference, noted that it represented an interesting development in the experiment's progression, and observed that the Kryptonian's bioelectric disruption could not be maintained indefinitely. Superman's response was simple. It did not need to be maintained indefinitely. It only needed to last long enough to prove that the convergence could be influenced by factors the Beyonder had not accounted for in his calculations. And if one variable could be introduced, others could follow. The Beyonder considered this for a moment that stretched subjectively longer than objective time should have allowed. Then he stated with the finality of someone closing a discussion that the next phase of the experiment would account for such interference. He had gathered sufficient data about Superman's capabilities. Adjustments would be made. Then he was gone again, leaving Superman glowing in the upper atmosphere, his energy reserves depleting rapidly, his interference with the convergence already fading as his charge ran low. But he had learned something critical. The Beyonder was not omnipotent, merely vastly powerful. His experiment was not inevitable, merely very well planned. And most importantly, he could be surprised, could be forced to adapt, which meant his control over events was not absolute. Superman descended back toward the fragmenting city below, already formulating the next stage of whatever desperate plan could be assembled from the scraps of hope and physics he had available. The convergence continued. The timeline compressed. Reality fractured further with each passing hour. But now Superman knew the fight was not already lost. It was merely very close to being lost, which was a different category of problem entirely. And different categories of problems required different categories of solutions. Superman gathered every reserve of solar energy his cells had accumulated since crossing into this universe, pulling power from depths of his biology that were meant to remain untapped except in the direst circumstances. His body became a star in miniature radiation, pouring from him in wavelengths that ranged from radio frequencies to gamma rays, each photon carrying not just energy but information encoded in patterns that his Kryptonian heritage had imprinted at the cellular level. The information was memory. Every moment since he had landed in Kansas as an infant, every choice made in Smallville under open skies, every rescue, every loss, every instant, where he had chosen hope over despair despite evidence suggesting despair was the more rational response. Decades of accumulated experience compressed and converted into bioelectric signatures that his aura radiated into the space around him. He was not attacking the Beyonder. He was broadcasting himself, his entire existence, as a conscious being who had built meaning from meaninglessness and purpose from random chance. The Beyonder was a creature of pure intellect, vast and ancient, capable of manipulating reality at fundamental levels. But intellect without experience was incomplete, was unable to model consciousness that arose from limitation rather than transcendence. The broadcast propagated outward at light speed, each wave carrying the signature of what it meant to be Superman. Not the powers or the abilities, but the choice to use those advantages for protection rather than domination. The memory of standing between innocent and threat, even when doing so accomplished nothing, except bearing witness to suffering. The bone-deep certainty that conscious beings deserve to exist free from arbitrary control, regardless of what higher intelligences might prefer. The effect on the convergence was immediate and catastrophic to the Beyonders' carefully orchestrated experiment. Reality had been collapsing according to mathematical principles, two incompatible physics frameworks being forced into synthesis through manipulation of fundamental constants. But Superman's broadcast introduced a variable that could not be reduced to mathematics. Consciousness. Will. The irreducible fact that beings capable of self-awareness could choose to oppose even processes that appeared inevitable. The coupling field between universes began to destabilize. Not because Superman was physically disrupting it, but because the Beyonders' control over the process required perfect predictability, required that all variables be accounted for in advance. And consciousness properly expressed was fundamentally unpredictable. It could choose courses of action that violated expected utility, could assign value to outcomes that pure logic would dismiss as irrational. Superman could feel the Beyonders' attention focusing on him with an intensity that would have been crushing if directed through conventional means. But this was not conventional conflict. This was a collision between two entirely different modes of existence, one that had transcended limitation and one that had built identity from limitation's constraints. The Beyonder manifested again this time, not in human approximation, but as pure presence, a weight in space-time that bent perception around it like light warping near a black hole. His communication came not through language, but as direct transmission of concept into Superman's consciousness. He acknowledged the interference, noted that Superman's broadcast was introducing complexity that the experiment had not been designed to accommodate. Observed that emotional resonance was affecting the coupling field in ways that violated expected physical behavior. The convergence was no longer proceeding according to controlled parameters. It was becoming chaotic, unpredictable, precisely the opposite of what the Beyonder had intended. Superman's response was to intensify the broadcast, pouring more energy into the signal, despite the cost to his physical reserves. He had no words for what he was transmitting. It was not a message, but a demonstration, a proof through existence that consciousness mattered, that the choices beings made in defiance of overwhelming circumstance had weight and consequence. The Beyonder's presence flickered, not weakening, but experiencing something it had not encountered in eons of existence. Uncertainty. For a mind that had observed countless realities and predicted their evolution with near-perfect accuracy, uncertainty was novel, disturbing, intolerable. He attempted to compensate to adjust his manipulation of the convergence to account for Superman's emotional interference. But consciousness was not a variable that could be solved for and neutralized. It was a fundamental property of certain patterns of matter and energy, and those patterns could choose to oppose even cosmic-level entities if the circumstances required it. The rift between universes began to contract. Not smoothly or predictably, but in chaotic pulses that suggested the coupling field was losing coherence. Reality fragments that had been bleeding through from DC's universe snapped back to their origin dimension. Buildings that had existed in superposition resolved into single states. Time resumed flowing according to consistent parameters rather than fragmenting into incompatible chronologies. The Beyonder's presence intensified not in aggression, but in what Superman's consciousness interpreted as something close to frustration. The entity had invested significant effort in this experiment, had neutralized cosmic hierarchies and disabled artifacts specifically to ensure uninterrupted observation. And now a single consciousness operating from a biological platform, limited to four-dimensional space-time, was disrupting the entire carefully constructed scenario. Superman felt his reserves depleting past sustainable levels. The broadcast was consuming energy faster than his cells could replenish it from solar absorption. He had minutes at most before complete exhaustion, and when that happened, the Beyonder could simply wait for him to collapse and then resume the convergence without interference. But minutes were enough. Enough to prove that the convergence could be reversed. Enough to demonstrate that the Beyonder's experiment could be opposed by forces he had dismissed as irrelevant. Enough to introduce doubt into a mind that had not experienced genuine uncertainty in timescales that predated galactic formation. The rift contracted further the dimensional barrier between Marvel and DC, reasserting itself as the coupling field lost structural integrity. Superman could feel both universes pulling away from each other, the natural separation between realities overcoming the artificial pressure that had been forcing them into contact. Then the Beyonder withdrew. Not in defeat, entities of his magnitude did not experience defeat in conventional terms, but in recalculation. Superman had introduced data that required the entire experiment to be reconsidered, had proven that variables existed which the Beyonder's vast intellect had failed to properly weight. The convergence was no longer proceeding according to design, which meant continuing, it would yield corrupted results. Better to withdraw, reassess, and perhaps design a different experiment under conditions that accounted for the interference patterns that consciousness could generate when properly motivated. The presence vanished, and with it went the coordinated pressure driving the convergence. The rift continued contracting the barrier between universes, healing like tissue, regenerating after trauma. Reality stabilized laws of physics, reasserting themselves in their proper configurations. Superman's broadcast finally exhausted his reserves. He fell from the sky above what was once again purely Marvel's New York solar energy, depleted to levels that made even flight difficult to maintain. He managed a controlled descent landing on a rooftop with enough force to crack concrete, but not enough to cause structural collapse. His uniform was scorched from the radiation he had been emitting. His cellular structure was depleted past any level he had experienced since the earliest days of his powers manifesting. But he was conscious, functional, and around him, the city was resolving into singular reality, rather than fragmentary superposition. The convergence had stopped. The experiment had been disrupted. Both universes would survive their separation, maintained by the barriers that were meant to keep realities isolated from each other. Superman allowed himself to sink to his knees, every muscle in his body screaming exhaustion, and permitted himself a moment of satisfaction that the impossible had been accomplished through nothing more complex than the absolute refusal to accept inevitability. Above him, the rift was nearly closed, shrinking toward the pinpoint that would mark complete separation between dimensions. Below him, the city was beginning to process what had happened. Emergency services mobilizing to address the chaos of the past hours, while trying to comprehend how catastrophe had been averted. And somewhere in the space between realities, a consciousness vast beyond human comprehension was reconsidering assumptions about what variables mattered when conducting experiments on the nature of existence itself. Superman stood on trembling legs, looked up at the sky that was once again solely Marvel's, and prepared himself for whatever consequences would follow from having saved two universes, while simultaneously ensuring his permanent exile from the one he called home. The rift sealed itself at dawn, the dimensional barrier between universes, here healing until no trace remained of the wound that had threatened to destroy both realities. Superman felt it close with a finality that resonated through his exhausted cells, a sense of completion that carried no satisfaction, because it meant what he had known intellectually was now confirmed at the visceral level. He could not go home. The energy he had broadcast during his confrontation with the Beyonder had permanently entangled his bioelectric signature with Marvel's reality. He was no longer merely a visitor from another dimension, but had become part of the quantum substrate of this universe, his cellular structure incorporated into the fundamental framework in ways that made extraction impossible without tearing open the very rift he had just sealed. Dr. Strange appeared beside him on the rooftop, mystical teleportation restoring functions that had been disabled during the Beyonder's interference. The Sorcerer Supreme's expression carried professional assessment overlaid with something approaching sympathy. He confirmed what Superman already understood. The convergence had been prevented. Both universes had survived intact, and the price for that survival was Superman's permanent residence in a reality that was not his own. Strange also reported that cosmic artifacts were functioning again across the globe. The Infinity Gauntlet had regained its connection to fundamental forces. His own link to the Vishanti had been restored, though the entities seemed subdued, as though even beings of their magnitude had been shaken by how close existence had come to catastrophic restructuring. The cosmic hierarchy was reasserting itself, order returning to replace the chaos of the past days. In DC's universe, Strange's scrying revealed the Source Wall's fragments were being contained by Green Lantern Corps, working in concert with forces Superman did not recognize. The Justice League had weathered the dimensional instability, confused by manifestations they could not explain, but ultimately safe from the convergence that would have consumed them had Superman failed. Lois was safe. John was safe. The world he had spent decades protecting continued its existence, saved by his sacrifice, though unaware of the specific nature of what he had prevented. Superman stood his depleted reserves, beginning the slow process of solar recharge as the morning sun rose over New York. The light felt slightly wrong, the wavelength carrying harmonics his cells would never process with the same efficiency as his native star. But it was enough. It would always be enough, because his Kryptonian biology was adaptable in ways that transcended simple physics. Below the city was waking. Emergency services were still processing the chaos of the convergence, but the immediate crisis had passed. Buildings stood in singular states rather than flickering between architectural impossibilities. Time flowed consistently again. Reality had stabilized into the configuration it was meant to maintain. Strange departed with a nod that conveyed respect without pity, understanding that Superman required neither comfort nor platitudes about his situation. The choice had been made, the consequences accepted, and dwelling on what could not be changed served no purpose. Superman launched into the air, testing his flight capability against the exhaustion that still weighted his muscles. He rose slowly, each 100 feet, requiring deliberate effort, but he rose nonetheless. By the time he reached 5,000 feet, the movement had become automatic again, his body remembering how to navigate three-dimensional space without conscious direction. From this altitude, he could see the full scope of the world he now inhabited, a planet much like the one he had grown up on, populated by beings whose hopes and fears and aspirations differed in detail but not in fundamental essence from those he had sworn to protect since the day he first revealed himself in Metropolis. This Earth was fractured in ways his had not been. The divisions between mutant and baseline human, between enhanced individuals and ordinary citizens, ran deeper than the conflicts he had mediated back home. Fear dominated where trust should have existed. Suspicion replaced cooperation, and the default assumption seemed to be that power would be abused rather than wielded responsibly. He understood now what Strange had told him during their first communication. This was not a world that needed a god imposing order through superior force. This was a world that needed someone willing to stand between threat and innocent, even when doing so accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the choice to protect could be made regardless of circumstance. He could be that person. He had been that person for longer than most civilizations had existed. The location might have changed, the specific individuals he would defend might carry different names and faces, but the fundamental equation remained identical. Superman descended toward the morning streets, already hearing the sounds of people beginning their routines, already detecting the subtle indicators of problems developing that might require intervention. His enhanced senses would need time to fully catalog this world's patterns, to learn which frequencies indicated genuine emergency versus ordinary urban noise. But the learning process would come naturally with experience. He had decades to acquire that experience, perhaps centuries given Kryptonian longevity. Time enough to earn this world's trust, to prove through sustained action that his presence represented protection rather than domination, to become not an alien imposter, but a genuine guardian of a reality that had not asked for him, but had received him nonetheless. The thought carried neither bitterness nor resignation. It was simple acknowledgement of circumstance, acceptance of the path that his choices had created. He had saved 2 universes. The cost was permanent separation from everything familiar, exile into strangeness that would never entirely feel like home. But home was not a location. It was a choice about what mattered and who deserved protection. By that definition, Superman had found home the moment he decided that these people, strange, fractured, fearful as they were, deserved the same dedication he had given to the citizens of Metropolis. Somewhere above the fragmenting dimensions, the Beyonder observed this resolution with interest that bordered on the academic. The experiment had failed in its original objectives, but had yielded data about consciousness and choice that would require extensive analysis. Perhaps in another eon, under different conditions, a similar test might be attempted with adjustments accounting for the variables that had proven so disruptive. But for now, Earth 6 Funksings could continue its chaotic evolution, its trajectory altered by the permanent addition of a consciousness that embodied principles the Beyonder found simultaneously incomprehensible and compelling. Superman landed in an alley where his enhanced hearing had detected someone in distress. The situation was mundane by cosmic standards, a robbery in progress. Baseline humans wielding conventional weapons against a victim who possessed nothing except the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He stepped into view, and the would-be criminals froze their recognition of the figure who had just saved the world from dimensional catastrophe, overriding whatever desperation had driven them to violence. Superman offered them the choice to walk away. They took it, fleeing into the morning streets, while their intended victims stared at him with an expression mixing awe and uncertainty. He asked if she was injured. She shook her head, still processing the reality that Superman, the alien, the stranger, the being who should not exist in this universe, had intervened in something as trivial as a street crime. He wished her safety in her continued journey, then lifted back into the air, already hearing the next situation requiring attention, already cataloging the patterns of a world that was now his to protect. The morning sun climbed higher. The city found its rhythm. Life continued with a relentless momentum that characterized conscious existence throughout every reality. And Superman, last son of a Krypton that existed in another universe entirely, began the work of becoming Earth 616's reminder that hope was not merely an emotion, but a choice that could be made every day, in every circumstance, regardless of how impossible the odds appeared. The story of Superman and Marvel had begun not with thunder and catastrophe, but with a simple act of protection in an alley most people would never notice. Exactly as it should be.